All right, so we're very happy to have another lunch talk today in our sustainability lunch talk series. Today we have Kevin Helfer, who recently, just in September last year, obtained his PhD from TU Delft, working on cumulus clouds in the North Atlantic trade wind region. I want to know what that is at some point. After that, Kevin left academia to work at Infoplaza, but he's still active at Scientists4Future in the Netherlands, where he's a member of the National Coordination Group, organizes webinars, and fulfills various editorial duties for the Klimaat Help Desk, a website where laypersons can ask questions about the climate crisis. So I think that's a really cool initiative that you built up there, and I'm looking forward to hear more about your activities. So thank you for being with us today, Kevin.
Yes, yeah, thanks for having me and for giving me this opportunity. And maybe I can quickly, well, first of all, let me share my screen. So, yeah, so maybe first of all, to maybe quickly tell the story how this talk came about. I was actually looking for a speaker for our seminar series, and I reached out to Leo to put me in touch with a potential speaker, which worked out. And then Leo said, yeah, well, can't you also give a talk in our sustainability lunch seminars? And yeah, that's why I'm here today. And yeah, I'm going to talk to you about Scientists4Future here in the Netherlands, and tell you a bit about what we've been doing and what we are, who we are, and if you're interested, how you can get involved. So here on the title slide, you just see an impression of some of the people who make up Scientists4Future. It's really just a random collection of photos, but yeah, I think it's always nice to see some faces to an organization. Diving right into it, what is Scientists4Future? And yeah, these are some paragraphs from our charter. And I've highlighted a few key words in there. So first of all, Scientists4Future is a platform. And basically that means that we're not a really very well-defined organization where people do something and other people tell them what to do or something like that. It's really more a loose connection of people who have the same goal. And that's kind of the next thing that's highlighted here, namely safeguarding the habitability of the earth for humans and other species. So that's also formulated very broadly. So we're not only concerned about the climate crisis, also about the biodiversity crisis, and basically anything that is important to keep our planet habitable. And then, yeah, what kind of unites us is that we want to raise our voices and that we want to do something about this. And then the last part that's kind of highlighted here is that we welcome people from all disciplines. So you don't need to be a climate scientist or biodiversity scientist. You can really be, you can also be an astronomer to join us. Yeah, so maybe quick look at our history. Basically how it started is 2 years, or actually now already nearly 3 years ago. There was a big climate strike in September 2019 in The Hague was that. And that was kind of part of a really global climate strike. I think it was one of the largest ones that Fridays for Future had organized until then. And at that point in Germany, a letter was written by the German Scientists4Future, and they were the first ones to come up with this idea of having Scientists4Future. And this letter basically just said, okay, we scientists, we checked what Fridays for Future is saying, these students who are not going to school on Fridays, and the science behind what they're saying is solid. So kind of giving them a bit more credibility. And yeah, in Germany, that letter was signed by more than 12,000 scientists. And here in the Netherlands, we wrote a similar letter, and we also got about 2,000 signatures. Among them, quite a few full professors as well. So yeah, that was kind of the kickoff, and in my eyes also a first success. So I already mentioned that Scientists for Future is kind of a platform, and this is kind of how it's organized. I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically what you see here is we have different circles, project groups, however you want to call them. In the center, we have the national body, and that sounds super important, but it's basically just whoever happens to show up at the national meetings. Everybody's welcome to join there. So even if you're if you just joined, you can come to the national body and be kind of part of this central organ. And then around that, we have kind of groups that maybe are affiliated to a certain university. So that would be a local group, or that's based in a certain city. I know there is a local group in Leiden as well. Then there are also project groups who work on specific projects or problems. Yeah, and I'm going to give you some examples about that. And then there's the coordination group, which is kind of a specific or a special project group, because that's kind of the group that makes sure that everything keeps running a bit. So scheduling the national meetings, for example, keeping an eye on the mailbox, all that kind of stuff. What I find it very important to point out is that the coordination group is not is not on a higher hierarchical level. So it's just the 4 or 5 people who happen to take care of the organizational stuff. And then here on the left, on the right, you also see a small bubble about Scientists for Future International. So we're also in loose contact to other Scientists for Future charters. For example, in Germany, recently a group in the UK got founded. So we're also in touch with them.
And since you're such a small group, I think if there's comments, perhaps they can just be brought.
Oh yeah, sure. Please,
Anne,
please
just
do.
get a comment. Not sure if you want to make it in person, Anne.
Yeah, it's that you mentioned that there's a group in Leiden. So there are a few active people, but it's, at least since I joined, it's not like a really structured group. So we're trying to get a bit more of a team going there. So just want to point that out. Like if people are interested in kind of joining and making the Leiden crowd a bit more cohesive, I think they're really nice. The most active group I think is mostly in Amsterdam, and some people also in Texel and in Utrecht. So there's a few other cities where the local teams are a little bit more like working together. And that's hopefully gonna come a bit more in the future.
Basically, it also depends, or it's really very different per city. So you mentioned that Texel or NIOS basically is quite active at the moment. Twente is also a very active group, but these two teams, they are set up in completely different ways, and that's basically up to each local group to decide how they want to set it up.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question? You also have the core group here. I'm not sure if you mentioned that. What is that doing? Is that the same as the coordination group? Apparently not.
No, the core group is basically, it's a kind of the most active people, so to say. It's not really very well defined, and it's, that's why I put it in quotation marks. I would say the most active people of like the whole of the whole platform. One other thing to mention, the national body is the kind of organ, so to say, that makes decisions, if there are any decisions to be made. So, for example, if recently we wrote this charter to define what actually we are, we didn't have that before, and that was then kind of passed by the national body. More generally, we make decisions on a principle that basically whoever is affected by that decision should be informed, and then the decisions should be made in consensus. So far, that worked quite well. Next slide. So maybe this all sounds a bit abstract, but maybe it becomes a bit clearer what Scientists for Future actually is when we compare it to different environmental groups. For example, Fridays for Future or Teachers for Climate, those are not scientists. So that's one thing that's very important for us. We are scientists. We didn't really define very well what scientists are. So if, for example, a master student really sees himself or herself as a researcher, then that person can definitely join Scientists for Future. Comparing us to Milieu Defensie or Fossil-Free NL, those are NGOs, which we are not. So we don't really have a legal status. We're not a vereniging in Dutch or a foundation. So that it's really a very grassroots organization. Scientist Rebellion, well, they are scientists. They are also not an NGO, but they have very different methods to us. We ourselves, we don't really organize protests ourselves. We do join them occasionally, but we don't organize them ourselves. So that's something that's different for Scientist Rebellion. And then there's also Scientists for XR, which is kind of the scientist branch within Extinction Rebellion. They also have different methods, and our relationship to XR is a bit, well, not defined. Officially, we don't really endorse it specifically because a lot of people have problems with XR, but we also don't say that XR shouldn't exist or something like that. And by the way, there are people who are active at Scientists for Future and also in XR. So there's some overlaps. So yeah, in summary, we all have kind of the same goal, but Scientists for Future really has this very specific niche of scientists. And yeah, maybe that's something that's also very vague. What actually is this niche of scientists? And that's also something that we ourselves are talking about a lot and struggling with. So maybe that's something for the discussion afterwards. But what do you think the niche of scientists is? Some examples of what we work on. Yeah, the Klimaathelpdesk, that's also one of the things where I'm active. And yeah, here you see a screenshot of our website or of the
first question is excellent.
Yeah. So basically how it works, you see here at the bottom, there's a button where you can ask a question, and anybody can ask a question. And then behind the scenes, we kind of, well, we accept that question, or maybe sometimes we reformulate it a bit if that's needed. But then basically we kind of try to find a scientist who can answer that question. And then that scientist writes an answer, which gets peer reviewed by somebody else, and then it ends up on the website. And you see that these questions are really very, very different. So this first one is how do I dress sexy but still sustainable? The next one, is there some, or how sustainable are coffee and tea? And is there something like a climate neutral cappuccino? But then also really questions that go into the science. Can extra evaporation of water through climate change cause the sea level to decrease. Yeah, so that's the Klimathilfe desk, which also was founded about 2.5 years ago, and which is now really a separate group and project because it's gotten so big, and it's also a foundation by now with their own finances.
Can I ask a question about this? Since
Yes.
I don't know if we're doing like super informal, and I think it's good. I'm curious if this is something that you also collaborate with journalists or like people who write, who do this more like as their profession, to do science communication.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, the Klimathilfe desk has a I'm not sure what it's called. It's kind of an advisory board, I think. And there we have like we have a few communication scientists in there who help us with how to communicate about climate.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really interesting to learn how to communicate effectively, to really bring your message across, but also to communicate in a way that people understand what you're saying. Yeah. Because that way of communicating is really very different to what is written in the IPCC reports.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting. Yeah. Just I was thinking about it because I happen to be married to a climate reporter at non-partisan, which is this like Dutch news website. And they also have, I think, a similar spirit platform where anyone can ask questions and then they pick like a question to answer. But I think it's maybe less, they only answer the questions that they like. So I'm not sure if,
in fact, some of our very first questions, we got them from non-partisan. So we took the questions that they had on their website at that point, and we got them peer reviewed. Okay. And then those were basically the first questions we had on the Klimathilfe desk.
Yeah.
How many questions do you get per week, month?
It differs a lot. So in a normal week, there are usually 1 or 2 questions, but then we also have like, if there's something specific happening, like a protest, or we sometimes have like special events, like we have live events in Utrecht sometimes where people give talks for the Klimathilfe desk, and then we really have like 10 or 20 questions in a week. And another project is called Fossil-Free Finance. And this kind of was previously called AVP project. And maybe you've heard that AVP, which is like the pension fund of all universities in the Netherlands, recently decided that it would divest from fossil fuels. And yeah, this Scientists4Future AVP project was kind of part of a really big campaign that put pressure on AVP. And what we specifically did was to reach out to university boards to also put pressure on this, so that really the directors of the universities approach AVP directly. And yeah, so this was successful. So that's something that doesn't happen a lot, that you really get your demands or see your demands being fulfilled. And yeah, so now this kind of group of people who did this previously are now taking a broader look at finance. So maybe, for example, which banks are university using, which insurances are they using. Yeah, still lots of work to do here.
Something else that I could add, I've been to 1 or 2 of the meetings there, and Leo, we discussed this as well, like to look at the funding that universities receive from
exactly.
Yeah. And that's like another angle, which I think is really interesting, because there was recently this letter from American and British scientists to their universities to kind of ask them for transparency on the funding that they receive. So that's something, another kind of way in which the financial story is kind of interesting for us scientists.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, especially a lot of these technical universities in the Netherlands, they really get a lot of funding from companies like Shell, which, yeah, you wonder, and it's not really not clear how much money they get,
Exactly.
and yeah, how much influence does Shell then have on the research? So that's yeah, that's really an interesting question. Outreach and education, it's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the whole idea of what we as scientists want to do. We want to educate people and yeah, help them with their questions about climate change. And yeah, this screenshot here is a really great example where we organized a workshop for high school teachers in the Netherlands to teach them about climate change. One problem at schools is that climate change is not really a main part of the curriculum at the moment. So it's basically up to the teachers to add it to their lessons if they want to. But for that, they, of course, need to know how it works and the science behind it to teach to their students. Yeah, then there are these webinars, this webinar series that I mentioned. And yeah, next week we'll have a talk by yeah, someone from Leiden. That's what I mentioned at the beginning. And basically, this webinar series is not really meant as a, but it's really aimed at scientists who probably already know a lot about the science behind climate change and ecology and biodiversity, but it's really meant to really focus on the role of scientists in this whole crisis. So how can we, well, in this example, how can we reduce the ecological impact of our computer simulations? But also questions, how can we as scientists deal with our worries about this crisis? How can we protest if we want that? So a lot of questions that are really aimed at scientists who are engaging in this.
I can also recommend looking on the YouTube channel, because all
yes,
of these,
so that's
when I joined, I listened back to quite a few old ones, and I think they're really excellent.
Yeah. So yeah, I should mention that we have a YouTube channel, and you can also watch these webinars back. There's a small collection by now, so yeah, feel free to check it out on YouTube. The other project is TÜV-frei, so that's peat-free in English. And yeah, that's basically, it's quite a small group who are looking at how we can, yeah, the peat is kind of, is really a, is used for potting soil, that's the word. But it has a huge climate impact, because it's mostly made from peat, this potting soil. But yeah, we can easily use soil that doesn't use peat. But yeah, up until recently, there were actually no major supermarkets or gardening shops that offered peat-free potting soil. And now, yeah, since a few weeks, Gamma has this peat-free potting soil, because we kept calling them and reaching out to them. And there was also some of this project group, they wrote this article, which was in the Volkskrant a few weeks ago. Yeah, kind of looking at how we can, if it's maybe feasible to forbid potting soil with peat. And yeah, spoiler alert, that would be a very easy low-hanging fruit, and it's definitely doable. And then kind of as mentioned, we don't really organize protests ourselves, but we do join them. Also do contact our universities and put pressure on them so that they change their policies. There's also always this idea to do some political lobbying, but that's of course very hard if you don't have these contacts. We do write letters to the parliament occasionally if there's something very specific. But yeah, that's definitely also something where we look for people who may be interested to do this. And that brings me to the end, kind of. Yeah, maybe let me end with some information how you can get involved if you want that. So yeah, we do really need everyone, and everyone can contribute. And what I always find very important to point out is that there is no minimum contribution. So if you're scared that you don't have enough time, then don't be. If you can contribute 1 hour per week, that's already a great contribution. And there are a lot of people who only contribute very little amount of time, but yeah, every little bit helps and can make a significant difference. The best thing is to just send us an email or get in touch on social media. And then, yeah, we will put you in touch with an integrator who will personally with you check what you want to do. If you want to create a new project, if you want to join a specific group, which group that could be, what interests you, and so on. And yeah, with that, I'll thank you for your attention. And yeah, I'll take any questions or thoughts or ideas